Welcome to Et al., a podcast from Baylor University Press, where we interview authors and publishing experts to bring you the best scholarship in the fields of scriptural, historical, and theological studies, as well as the world of academic publishing. Thanks for joining us. Welcome, everyone, to Et al., a podcast of Baylor University Press. I'm your host, Anna Kate, and I am joined here today for a very special edition of the podcast. We are having a Homiletics Roundtable with some of our foremost experts in the field of homiletics. I'm joined today by Jerusha Neal, who's the Associate Professor of Homiletics at Duke Divinity School and the author of Holy Ground, Climate Change Preaching, and the Apocalypse of Place. We also have with us Trey Clark, who's the Assistant Professor of Preaching and Spiritual Formation in the School of Mission and Theology, as well as the Dean of Chapel at Fuller Seminary. And he's also the author of Black Contemplative Preaching. We have with us Jake Myers, who's the Wade P. Huey Jr., Associate Professor of Homiletics at Columbia Theological Seminary and the co-author of Preaching Philosophy. And finally, we have Chelsea Yarborough, who's the Associate Director of Leadership Programming at the Association of Theological Schools, and who is the author of the forthcoming book, Proclamation Beyond the Pulpit. Welcome, you guys. Thanks for being with us.
Thanks for having us.
Yeah.
We're so glad you guys are here. So let's jump right in. Homiletics, which is all of your fields, refers to the art of preaching, and you guys are all engaged in the study of homiletics. But where does the field of homiletics kind of stand right now? How would you describe the state of things? And what are the key areas that you see in the field?
I'll get us started by saying I just think we have been doing deep work as teachers of preaching on how to listen better to the places where we stand, listen better to voices that haven't been centered in the conversation, listen better to preaching that is happening outside of church spaces, perhaps preaching that isn't called preaching. And I also think there is this question in the field right now, not just what does it mean to listen to each other better, but what does it mean to listen for where God is showing up and where God is standing in this work. And I just think we're all pressing into those questions right now.
Yeah, I'll add to that, 'cause in the spirit of like listening, when I first saw your question, Anna Kate, I thought about the quote from Zora Neale Hurston, where she says, "Some years ask questions and some years give answers." And so I think similarly, some eras ask questions and some eras give answers. And in my opinion, I think if we are wise, we're in the era of questions, of asking a lot of questions about what has been preaching. Is that the current confines of what we want preaching to be? What might be the possibilities of proclamation? What are the stakes of proclamation right now? What does that mean for our pedagogy? And so I'm hearing in just a lot of good conversations, really in-depth questions that are responding, of course, to questions of the past and hopeful to what it might evolve for the future. But I would say that it's an era of deep and integral questions that I think are going to shape whatever the next future and era will be.
I would add to the conversation, one way to think about certain themes or pressing issues in this moment in the field of homiletics is to think about what some of our annual gatherings have focused on in the Academy of Homiletics. And some of those areas have included the need for preaching to build bridges across racial and gender and political and other divides. There's been a strong emphasis on the importance of centering voices and traditions that historically have been minoritized. And I think there's also a greater focus on the need to think about the social and political ramifications of our proclamation, or we might think about the afterlife of the sermon. How does our sermon actually affect the material conditions in the places that we're engaged in the act of proclamation? So those are some of the themes. This year we'll be thinking about the relationship between preaching and place through Rich Voles, who's going to be leading us as our president this year.
Yeah, I really love the work that's been done. I also think, to add one thing, is I've seen in the last few years, I'm getting a little bit more granular about how the positionality of the preacher functions within the socio-political chaos that a lot of us are experiencing these days. And I'll point to Trey as a great example of this. Henry Mitchell wrote his seminal work, Black Preaching, kind of as an umbrella category, which pushed the field in really important ways. But then, we have Trey saying, there's this Black contemplative preaching strand that has always been operative through the Black preaching tradition. And so it's kind of like pinpointing like what that would look like, which I really love his book. I see Jerusha's doing, really, really important things, building this bridge between homiletics and climate crises, and place is absolutely fundamental to her work, which is really great that it's tying in with our theme for the Academy of Homiletics this year. And I love Chelsea's work. I haven't read the book yet. I can't wait till it comes out in September. But her essays, kind of looking at the authority structures that allow some people to occupy certain spaces and to limit other peoples from occupying those spaces, and the authority that the pulpit holds within our ecclesial structures. So that's really exciting to kind of see us all pushing the guild to think in more expansive ways and more creative ways about what do we mean when we talk about preaching, and what counts as preaching. And our colleague Danielle McCrae is also doing some really fantastic work on that, asking like, what's the genre? Like, do you hear somebody say something?
Yeah.
Is that a sermon or is it something else?
Mm.
And Liz Faye Ruiz is also like helping us to imagine like different ways of thinking about preaching. So there's all this really exciting stuff happening, and it's a fantastic time to be a homiletician, in my opinion.
Yeah, for sure. And I really liked what you said, Chelsea, that we're kind of in an era of asking questions. And I think the other three of you kind of touched on this in your responses as well, but even to what you're saying, Jake, that we've seen Black preaching as a thing, but kind of asking the question of, is that the entirety of Black preaching? Is this one method? In the same way, Chelsea, I know your work centers on proclamation outside of church. Is this the only way that we see it? And kind of continuing to ask those questions. So maybe you guys can point to some areas in homiletics that are neglected, some of these questions that we are continuing to ask within the academy, just to bring to light some of those things that are being neglected in the field.
I don't know that I want to use the word neglected, that because of the work that's happening, because of the conversations we just had around what's happening, what questions are evolving, I think that we need more work around the collective pedagogical consciousness. Like, what does this then mean for our teaching? If we got to point, if we have to pivot, if we need to expand, what are we actually training proclaimers for? And how do we adopt our teaching practices more widely and more intently towards the kind of agile proclaimers that are needed in the world that we're in? And so that is something that I'm in conversations about, of course, but I think that we need more actual, concretized work around is how does our teaching and our pedagogy meet the moment as well?
Mm.
Yeah, that's been a theme in a lot of recent books, Chelsea. I appreciate you naming that. And my colleague and co-conspirator, Sungu Yang, who co-wrote Preaching Philosophy with me, is not here, but his book, Arts in Preaching, he really pushes us to reimagine what homiletical pedagogy looks like. He says we've been focusing so much in the last few generations on the what and the how of preaching, but now we're moving more into questions of the who and the why. So thinking about the overall formation of preachers, not just learning a bunch of distinct tasks that, when you add them all together, make up sermon development and delivery processes, but how the process shapes preachers themselves. And so that's been really exciting work. People are doing more work with affect theory and the ways that preaching, shifts the effective atmosphere of congregations, and even when preaching takes place beyond congregational spaces. So that's a really exciting movement, I think.
Yeah, that's really helpful. And Trey, specifically, your book on Black contemplative preaching joins together two strands of homiletics that haven't always been brought together, and that we mentioned Black preaching and then contemplative preaching. So what is the benefit of exploring these two subfields together? And then are there any other fields in homiletics that need to be combined in these ways?
Yeah, so my work is trying to bring together Black preaching With contemplative preaching, and I would say more contemplative spirituality in general, there isn't a robust literature at this point on explicitly exploring contemplative preaching. So my book is trying to look at the different streams within the Black preaching tradition and highlighting specifically contemplative preaching as a more neglected or obscured stream. I think one of the gifts of focusing specifically on the diversity within our preaching traditions is it challenges the kind of essentializing tendency that can happen when we think about there being a theme that is singular called Black preaching or Asian American preaching.
Yeah.
So I hope more and more work continues to be done in showing the different streams that exist in minoritized preaching traditions in ways that open folks' imagination to think about the multiplicity of ways in which they might embody preaching within their particular heritage.
I think you're right that we do kind of tend to make these boxes that, you know, Latinx preaching looks like this, Asian American preaching looks like this, Black preaching looks like this. And it really is, you know, it's multidimensional and it's not just one size fits all. So I want to open it back up to everyone. What can marginalized or ignored voices bring to the homiletics table? And how do these voices impact the way homiletics is done?
So many answers to that question.
Yeah.
I'll just name one. I think marginalized voices help us hear our scriptures better. I mean,
Yeah.
I just, this last term, I was part of a program that the university where I teach does at a women's correctional facility in Raleigh. And we have divinity school students and inside students preaching together in this space. And one of the things that that sort of teaching does is you realize how much the text that we have has been shaped by carceral realities. And this is just bright when you are in that space. And so there's something about listening to voices that have been set aside that open up aspects of texts and insights about God that, heaven help us, we thought we knew. And so I mean, this is, I want to just say, this is not icing on the cake kind of conversation. Like these conversations actually are central to our task as homileticians, discerning what is the living voice of God that is speaking in and through a text to a given community on a given day. I think marginalized voices are essential to that sort of work.
Yeah, there was, a lot of the kind of in the mid 20th century, the homiletics thinking, when they said homiletics, they really meant white homiletics. And really, if we're even more granular, white straight male homiletics. And then texts that came out like they were kind of about identitarian homiletics were kind of on the fringe, but we're seeing that come more into the mainstream as, I'll speak to my own Columbia Seminary community here. When I started 10 years ago here, it was like 90% white, 90% Presbyterian. And now we have so many international students. We have so many African American students from the Atlanta area and from all over the country. So the pedagogies have to shift, Otherwise, we're just teaching people stuff that they can't, it's kind of useless in their particular denominational and cultural context. So yeah, I think learning alongside our students about how we interpret text for proclamation, how we think about our cultural contexts and speak and preach into those contexts is expanding the homiletical repertoires, if I may.
Yeah, and I think what you're saying kind of directly lines up with what Jerusha was offering a little while ago. I love the metaphor of like, it's not just the icing on the cake, that it is the cake, and for different contexts, that is the substance, that is the preaching, that's the proclamation, that is the word of God. And so it is really interesting that, to what you're saying, it's not just a one, 90% Presbyterian, 90% white, but, inclusive of all the different interpretations of homiletics. And so, Chelsea, your work especially focuses on what you call the non-pulpit preaching of Black women and how their location outside of the pulpit kind of liberates them to speak in creative and fresh ways. So how do you feel that their location outside of the pulpit gives them that liberation?
I'm a parrot with the last question you asked. So one of
Yeah.
the things as I was listening to Jerusha and Jake, I began to think about was like what I think that listening to these listen expansively to voices, let's call it like that, reminds us is that everyone is coming from particularity, right?
Yeah.
And so, but everyone has not had to name their particularity because of power and privilege. And so the more that we have voices, and not just descriptive voices, but methodological voices, right? Where we're like, from these Black women, which is what I'm trying to suss out. From these Black women, we don't just get something to describe or to witness, but we actually get method and methodology and things that we can learn and take and push back on and be in conversation with. And so when I go to your second point, to your question about kind of how this expansive space was liberative for them, I think that before it was liberative, it was necessary for these Black women. Like, I don't know that if I were to ask Fannie Lou Hamer, in retrospect, if pulpit preaching would have been important to her. I don't even think it was in the frame of reference for something she was trying to do. But what happened was a moment occurred where rhetoric was necessary. And so it shifts idea around call. Who gets to call who? Who gets to decide
Yeah.
who's legitimate, right? It shifts idea around effective communication and context. Exegetical methods and what is valid biblical interpretation gets muddy. And so I actually think that because they preach, it actually liberates us in the homiletic to think about more expansively, man, what are these things I've decided must be? And how does assuming that these women were preaching, as opposed to needing to prove they were preaching by putting methods on them that don't fit or belong to them, to assume they were preaching and to listen, it actually liberates us to consider, wow, maybe there's some more spaces where God and the sacred have been speaking that maybe I've been missing because my ear has been attuned elsewhere.
Yeah. That's so good. Thank you, Chelsea. I love that too, that you're kind of saying they didn't do it because it was going to be liberating, but it's because it was necessary. It's what had to happen. And in that, they found liberation as well and provided it for those around them. And so that's really powerful. That's really powerful. So, Jerusha, you've written a book on climate change and preaching. And in each of your respective fields, what role can preaching play in addressing the concerns of modern life, whether social, political, or environmental, or something else too?
Thank you for the question. I want to just start by I think speaking to the thing under the thing in this whole conversation today, which is part of what's driving this sense of we need to listen better. The answers that we have not been expansive enough. Part of that is that in the midst of the opportunity of the present moment, there's also a crisis in the present moment. I think there is a crisis around hope and around preaching's, can I use that, much maligned word, relevance? Like, what does it matter? What does preaching matter? Is it just words, right? And the climate crisis highlights that for preachers, I think. Because even if you think about preaching as a way to sort of push the needle for legislative change or policy, recommendations or something. So many of the metrics we're using tell us scientifically that the window on really being able to stop and mitigate some of this crisis is closing very quickly. And so I think preachers face this crisis of what difference does it make what I say for 20 minutes, wherever I say it, whether it's in a pulpit or on the street or on a podcast, like what difference do words make? And I actually think that this is a fundamental question in the field right now. And one of the ways that I think preaching can be really helpful in engaging these deeply embedded, broken systems in our world is steering into the big theological questions at their heart. And I mean questions like, who are we? Who are we not? Where do we stand? What does it mean to be a creature? What does it mean to be in relation to a creator? What does it mean to face our inadequacy? What does it mean to look at our fallenness, right? And what does it mean to even begin to think through the cost of what redemption might mean, to even get at that word? Now, I'm using big theological language there, but in some ways, part of the reason I use those words is that a lot of times people think about these sort of social issue kinds of sermons as somehow, again, icing on the cake, somehow divorced from central core proclamatory themes in our preaching. And our scriptures don't treat them that way.
Yeah.
I mean, these things are central in the biblical text to what God is up to in the world. And
Yeah.
I think part of what preaching can do is root these issues down into the soil of deep, deep death work and new life work, right? Which is what soil is. We have those resources in our traditions, but we have to risk going there, letting our questions be big enough.
That's so important, Jerusha. I appreciate you bringing that to light. And what you said is just questioning the relevance, asking the big questions, and really just digging deep, like you said, into areas of life and death. You even brought up, the idea of restoration and how do we get there, And so I think that that's incredibly relevant in this conversation and just something that I think we do tend to kind of gloss over. But like you said, it's the substance. It's the big part of it, the big kahuna. So I appreciate that for sure. So Jake, you mentioned your colleague, Dr. Yang, who couldn't be with us today, but you guys have written a work which draws on French philosophy as a lens through which preaching can be understood. So I wonder, how does philosophy disrupt and shape homiletics?
Yeah, there's this phenomena, and I like to call it the trickle-down theory of homiletics.
Yeah.
So you have philosophers who are rethinking, epistemologies, ontologies, like how we think, how we are, how we exist in the world. And then about, a decade later, we have biblical scholars, we have theologians, ethicists, who are then taking that and helping us to think in different ways about how we interpret texts, how we understand God to be at work in the world. And then there was a trend of maybe 5 or 10 years later, then people are reading those biblical scholars, those theologians who have been reading the philosophers, and then it makes an impact on homiletical theories. So what Sungu and I have tried to do is to look at the key texts that are, I mean, for the lack of a better term, canon in homiletical theory, the texts that we all had to read when we were getting our PhDs in homiletics. People like Jarena Lee, Fred Craddock, Phillips Brooks, John Broadus, Henry Mitchell. And we do close readings of those texts that they shared with us. And then we're bringing post-structural French philosophy to bear on challenging some of the underlying assumptions that come together to form how we go about teaching preaching, how we go about doing our biblical interpretation for sermon delivery, how we think about our bodies in the pulpit. The experiences that people have as a result of the sermonic event, and the hope there is that by challenging some of these seminal features and figures in our tradition, we'll begin to see new expansive ways of thinking about what does it mean to hold homiletical authority. This was a big thing for Fred Craddock. He wrote his key text As One Without Authority in the late 1960s. It was published in the early 70s. And, there he helped us to understand this inductive movement of preaching. So we use Michel Foucault, who wrote a lot about power, knowledge, structures, to kind of question some of the assumptions that Craddock brings to bear on homiletics. That's just one example. But our hope is that by engaging these people who don't seem to be all that relevant for homiletics, that theoreticians like all of us gathered here and, our students will begin to find ways to open up preaching, to be more inclusive, more engaged with socio-political issues that are so important for people in the church and beyond the church.
Hey, can I just say one thing I really appreciate is how the book Preaching Philosophy speaks into Chelsea's call for us to really rethink pedagogy. I mean, um, I just I feel like that question about how we teach this and how is the method we're using to teach it consistent with what we really want to see. And I just see you grappling with that question so much in this
Yeah.
book. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you, Jerusha. The final chapter in the book uses the philosopher Gilles Deleuze to think about pedagogy. Deleuze had this idea of like the rhizome or like mushrooms that kind of like are all connected to one another as kind of a framework for thinking about teaching, where there's not this one core idea, but it's like this networking and ever shifting and changing nodes of understanding to challenge, what Friedrich Schleiermacher offered us, which was the arboreal or the tree-like model of theological education. So in the roots of the tree, we have philosophical theology, and then the trunk is our doctrinal theologies, our history, our biblical studies, and then the leaves is practical theology, where we are. So we use Deleuze to kind of challenge that arboreal model to make our homiletical classrooms more generative, more chaotic in a beautiful way. So yeah, that's a really important thing that Sungu and I really wanted to address in our book.
It sounds like too, Sungu and you, Jake, y'all have kind of used this French philosophy as the framework, or as a resource. And so I'm wondering if the others of you kind of have other disciplines that you've integrated or drawn upon in order to facilitate your understanding of preaching, and maybe to add to the pedagogy conversation we're engaging in as well, different methods of teaching this.
I would say my favorite part about hanging with homileticians is how inherently interdisciplinary we are, because
Yeah.
we have to be. I call homiletics the burpee of the curriculum, but don't because you got to use all the muscle groups to do and muscles you don't even know exist to do this thing well. And so I'm always very clear on what's happening in the other trainings because I can see how it's shaped in the preaching moment. But I'll jump in a little bit and just say, for me, one of the big ones that the methods that I've really had to learn and disciplines that I've had to learn more clearly is historical method as like just a method, not just kind of reading biography and things of that sort, which is what I thought I was going to do, but had too many historians in conversation with me that was like, no, you need to really like learn historical method and understand what it means to sit in archives and not necessarily know where you're headed. Which I didn't love at first. I was like, what's going on? But what it taught me was what people have told me before, but I feel like I've been able to touch it differently is that like the particularities of narrative and what people come from and who people are and what has shaped a moment are equally as important to study as the rhetoric, as the kind of rhetorical devices, etc. What I began to find is that pairing story and proclamation actually helped me understand the proclamation a lot more. And that came from knowing more about historical method. And so, yeah, history as a discipline has been a really crucial interlocutor with my work.
One of the things that I really appreciated in the work of Holy Ground is that it put me in conversation with climate science folks who teach at
It's
my
amazing.
university. And for lots of reasons, there's been a sort of breakdown in trust between climate scientists and religious leaders in the church. A lot of the climate denial stuff is actually, preached in local faith contexts. So that whole journey of really listening well to colleagues who are doing this work was really generative for me. That one of the things that surprised me in that was how much they wanted folks who are connected in faith communities in conversation, in part because they have, Jake, you brought up these rhizomes, right? They have this very in the dirt, grassroots understanding of how change happens, that it doesn't just happen top down from on high. Like there is the sense of local social networking that is proving to be fundamentally necessary in the climate fight. And there is a huge respect, I think, for the work of leaders in grassroots communities, whatever their ordination status, of like that work of how is it that we are connecting people and how is it that relationships get built. And so part of, oddly, what this kind of engagement with climate science has done for me is it's reminded me again of the importance of the work we do. It goes back to, just this sense of this bread and butter stuff that preachers do, knowing their people, knowing their community, learning the vernacular, relating in time, in real events, face-to-face contacts, like all of that stuff is proving critical. And it's sometimes very helpful to have people outside of your discipline, like, remind you of what's at stake in what you've devoted your life to.
Yeah, and I would just add, for me, my work is focused, particularly with the Black contemplative preaching book, was intersecting with Black church studies as well as work in Christian spirituality. And I found with Black church studies was essential in thinking about this rich history and the diverse cultural background, and particularly the Africana culture that informs and shapes preaching in the Black tradition, that it isn't something that's merely started in the US, but right, it has these deep Africana roots and practices that continue to show up in the embodiment and in the theology of Black preaching. And then also Christian spirituality. For me, it both shapes practices of interpreting scripture, but also draws attention to the person of the preacher and the importance of our character formation, our moral formation, and the ways in which the sermon is something that's not merely spoken, but lived, embodied, and what's the relationship between prayer and our proclamation as we seek to be witnesses of God's reign on earth as it is in heaven.
That's really helpful. And I like that all of you guys have pointed to the interdisciplinary nature of homiletics as a whole, but also just contextualizing it as far as where you are, not only within culture, within even your ethnic background or your cultural background, but also where we are in a environmental and political space and how we can exist in those places in a homiletical way. And so I've just really appreciated y'all's insights on that for sure.
Look, writing these things is a journey, so thank all of you.
Yeah, same to you.
The last question we have for today is, where do you see the field of homiletics going in the future? And so I'd love if each of you can maybe touch on your respective fields, but also more broadly and address homiletics as a whole.
What my hope for homiletics is that we're going to continue to be more inclusive. And so that when students from all kinds of different intersectional identities are in our classrooms, that they feel seen and they feel that they don't have to contort themselves into a homiletical box that we have created. The seminary I attended, I really felt that. I felt like there was a one size fits all approach to homiletics, and to the degree that I didn't conform, I was wrong as a preacher. But at this point, I had already been preaching for 10 years when I went to seminary. So it felt really denigrating of my experience and my denominational tradition. And thankfully, my colleague Anna Carter Florence and I at Columbia Seminary, we very much want to make the homiletics classroom be a space where everybody's challenged and everybody is affirmed, and that they can learn from one another. So that's my hope, and that's kind of where I see things going. Our colleague Jess Winterweedle just finished and defended her dissertation at Princeton Seminary on a queer homiletic, where she engages queer theology and performance studies to help make the pulpit a more hospitable place for openly LGBTQ clergy. So that's what I'm excited about, and I see my colleagues doing exactly that in their work. Pushing the boundaries, challenging the center, and opening up the pulpit for more just creative and expansive proclamation.
I was talking to Chuck Campbell, I think it was back in January, about what he was reading. He's retired now, but he still lives in town, so I can call him up. And he pointed me to this book that Eddie Glaude wrote during the first Trump administration called Begin Again, which is an engagement with James Baldwin, that talked about how was it that James Baldwin was able to keep going after so much disappointment and rage and one step forward and what felt like two steps back. Like how did this happen? And as rich as in that book. Glad near the beginning quotes Baldwin's Just Above My Head. And Baldwin there talks about not abdicating responsibility. And I just think that's a word we need right now. So much of where we are, which is either over the line or right up to the line of an authoritarian crisis in our country, I think is very related to what preachers and pulpits have said. And so I think the future of homiletics, and one of the things that I appreciate about each of the homiletic scholars on this call, is that in the midst of all of this thinking of theory and pedagogy and who are we listening to and methods and all of this, like at root, it is this question of how do we not abdicate responsibility in this time? How is it that we take ownership for what it is that God would have us be about at this moment in our nation, in this moment in the world, in this moment in the planet, in the church and without? Yeah. So I don't think that there's a future of homiletics that doesn't meaningfully engage that question. What is it that is ours to do, even if it would mean beginning again, asking questions we thought were answered? And what would that cost? And what might it yield?
Yeah, I resonate so deeply with your profound and important words, Jerusha. I find that students in classes that I teach are eager to know, why should we preach and what difference will it make for the world that we live in. And so that question of if we preach, how can we preach in ways that are responsible to changing the material conditions of our world, particularly for those who are most affected by injustice and systems that are oppressing. I also imagine that the future of homiletics will increasingly become a global, multidisciplinary conversation. And there'll be more efforts to center figures and traditions and modes of proclamation that have not maybe even been part of the conversation. There is so much work being done outside of the US on different aspects of preaching with different methodologies, different pedagogies. And I imagine that the conversation between the global South and the US will become more robust in the future. I also imagine that due to the increasing disillusionment with traditional religious structures and even moral failure and corruption, I think there'll be more attention to the formation of preachers, the person of the preacher, not in a way that becomes reductionistic or overly individualistic, but in a way that invites us, in the words of Henry Nowley, to grow into the truth that we speak. That part of our responsibility is to integrate into our life what we say with our lips.
I've been over here just thinking about what you all have said, and so it feels like both call and commission. So thank you for what we're seeing. I mean, when the first thing that comes to me is I hope homiletics goes beyond what I can see. Nothing excites me more than thinking about future scholars and current scholars being like, oh, you didn't push it far enough, or there's this other thing, there's this other question, because I think that's the gift of thinking and putting out there what we've thought, is that there are other folks that will engage it, practitioners who will see something different. And so one thing that I'm really hoping is that, or seeing or believing for, is that in addition to all of the expansiveness in the pulpit, which is crucial, which is important, is also that we figure out or think about how we equip spiritual leaders that primarily want to be activists and in the public square, that primarily want to be nonprofit leaders, that primarily want to be poets, that we are able to theologically think about the artists and what does that mean for proclamation, and that perhaps in a world where pulpit preaching becomes a subgenre of the wider understanding of proclamation and preaching as opposed to the only impulse. And to me, that gets at, to Trey's point about the disillusionment, it allows for more voices and more resources and more examples of people whose words have mattered. Maybe we should not always be looking at the pulpit to know, like, did this matter? How can we know? It's much harder to study a pastoral lane than to study the particularities of an exigent crisis and how a proclaimer who sees themselves as an organizer, an activist, has spoken right into the moment. And how can that be a dialectic with our pastors and our pulpit preachers? And so I hope homiletics becomes, even in practitioner world across the different platforms, a conversation about what can we learn from each other so that we all can do this thing more effectively that deeply, deeply matters, but it's not the only thing that matters. And so how does our practice begin to pair with our proclamation as a part of how we form proclaimers? So that's what I'm hoping.
Chelsea, your work on Fannie Lou Hamer is such a fantastic example of that.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Eager for your book.
Me too.
Well, I appreciate all of you, and not only your insights today on this podcast, but your contributions to the field as a whole and to just the world and thinking deeply about these issues. And so for those listening, I hope that you will read their works. Holy Ground, Preaching Philosophy, Black Contemplative Preaching are all available at Baylor Press. And if you are looking to purchase Chelsea's book, it will be out in September. And we are so excited for Proclamation Beyond the Pulpit. So I just want to thank once again each and every one of you for joining us today and for contributing to this conversation here on the podcast and in the field of homiletics. So thank you guys.
Yeah. Thank you, Anna.
Thank you, Kate, and to all of you all. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you for listening to Et Al, a podcast from Baylor University Press. We hope you've enjoyed today's episode. Make sure to like, comment, and subscribe to keep up with the latest from Et Al.